Soundstripe.
Hello and welcome to Heels in the Hierarchy, the podcast where we unpack the realities of working life, leadership and everything in between. I'm SJ.
And I'm Pegsy. In every episode, we take something that's often talked about in headlines or LinkedIn posts and ask what it actually looks like in real life.
Today's topic is one that can spark some real passionate opinions, I think. Glass ceilings. But we're not actually here, I don't think, to ask whether they exist, because frankly they do.
I agree. I think the more interesting question is whether that's the whole story, because we've both worked with incredibly capable women who've hit genuine organisational barriers. But we've also seen women hold themselves back when maybe nobody else was.
That's exactly. I think sometimes it is the system, but sometimes it's our own thinking. And quite often, I think possibly it's kind of happening at the same time. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I agree. It isn't about blame. It's about being honest. I think if we're trying to understand why progression feels so difficult, we really have to be willing to look back at all the moving parts.
I think something that came up when I was thinking about this is, and I think sometimes it gets often overlooked, is that not every single career path or career has somewhere obvious to go. So people talk about breaking through the glass ceiling as if there's another floor waiting above you. Does that make sense? But in a lot of organisations, sometimes there just simply isn't. So I've worked in places where there may be about 3 senior management roles and that's it. Nobody was really leaving. Everyone was good at what they did. And you could work brilliantly for years and still never progress, not because of your capability, because the opportunity wasn't there. So that's, for me, that's not about capability. It is about capacity and whether those roles are even available.
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction. Sometimes we label everything as discrimination when it's actually organisation structure, it's mental blockages, etc. And in sectors like education, healthcare, HR, you can have hundreds of talented people all aiming for the same handful of leadership roles.
I think you said something really interesting beforehand about the glass ceiling and the elevators. Do you remember?
Yeah.
That was really fascinating to me. Can you explain to our listeners what we were talking about?
Yeah, it was when we were talking about doing this episode, and it sort of occurred to me that when we talk about glass ceilings, we sort of see the ceiling as being the very top. So we can't smash the glass ceiling, we can't break through. And that has its roots in truth. Of course it does. But I think the other thing that we have to remember is that there are very few bungalows in the world. There are very few single-story office blocks. They're often multiple floors. So actually, the ceiling itself is potentially the top of the floor that you're currently on, trying to break through. But if there are other floors that you need to get to, then stop trying to smash the glass ceiling, open the door, go up the elevator onto the next floor. And the rationale behind that analogy is if you keep banging your head against a glass ceiling, you're going to give yourself a headache. If you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. If you then decide, I'm getting nowhere and I'm giving myself a headache, I'm going to go in the elevator, you either try and get a different route to your chosen destination through the elevator in your current organisation, or you say, my destination is the next floor, but maybe not in this building. So you go in the elevator, to follow that analogy, but you move buildings, you change organisations. So a glass ceiling, to me, is much more of a mindset. And as we've said, it's not a destination. If you make it the destination, it's always going to be there. You're never going to smash it. So a strange analogy, but it worked for me.
I really liked it because I think it reminded me that actually it's not always so linear in a career.
Mm.
I think when about the hierarchy, it's actually one grade after the other grade after the other grade. But actually, often, especially in our careers, we've had, like what you're saying, sometimes you've had to kind of move out of the organisation to then find another route in somewhere else, and that's kind of progressed not only your salary but your experience and leadership. And also, I think there's that caring responsibility that we've had before when people have gone out, had a break, and then come back. And I do think there's something around influence, but also opportunities, and maybe that mindset thing was something that reminded me of you don't always have to go into the next step, you can go out and back again.
No, exactly. Yeah, I mean, our caring responsibilities, they are improving, absolutely. Flexible work is more common than it was, but I still think there's an unspoken assumption that if somebody works part-time or flexibly, that they are somehow not only less ambitious, but arguably less capable, less committed. And to be fair, I don't have the stats available. If I can find something, I'll put it in the show notes. But I suspect that women who are in part-time roles for whatever reason are probably substantially less likely to have a promotion and to continue in a part-time capacity, but by virtue of their part-timeness.
Yeah, so I wonder if that actually, in reality then, if no one actually says it outright, it does influence people's perspective and opportunities. So, like, potentially projects get offered elsewhere.
Yeah.
Leadership opportunities often then potentially passes them by, or they're not considered because people assume that you wouldn't necessarily be interested. There's an assumption there. And actually, I think that opportunity is then taken from you without a conversation when nobody really asked them to make that decision for them. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. But
the ceilings that we build for ourselves, and we assume that we can't go for something as well on the flip side, maybe. I don't know.
And talking of flipping then, do you mind if I just flip it now? Because while those barriers are real, I also think that we as women underestimate ourselves. We know, that it is a feature of women's personalities. And I've lost count of the number of women that I've coached, that I've spoken to, who say, I'm just not quite ready. And I just think, says who? Says who?
Yeah. I totally recognise that. I've done it myself I think sometimes it's easier to convince yourself that you need more qualifications, or you need another year, or you need a bit more experience. Or I think sometimes we've talked about it in previous episodes that women are always needing to have every single thing on that essential criteria, rather than actually who we are as women. We are used to multitasking. We are used to having lots of different headspaces for different things and quick decision making, and they're real key skills that are not necessarily going to be on a CV. And I know we've talked about it, but I do think that is something that we trip ourselves up. So maybe we do create those glass ceilings for ourselves unconsciously because we assume that we wouldn't necessarily do it. So I think that's an interesting one, and something that I kind of recognise sometimes, that we maybe undersell ourselves rather than actually doing what men do and just overreach and then hope that we get it.
Well, this is the thing, and you're right. We've talked about this many times. I am saying this ironically, but sometimes somebody reads half the book, attends one workshop, they're already attending their LinkedIn profile to say that they're the expert. They put themselves out there with a level of confidence that then is not justified, arguably, and yet a woman who's got more experience but less confidence just doesn't put herself forward. I mean, it was ever thus, really, wasn't it?
I think that just reminded me that it's something about a confidence gap again, that it's not absolutely, it is never a competence gap. These very rare occasions, but if you're going for a senior position, you're going for the next step, you've either done that job for a long time, you know it inside out, and you've kind of been watching and then been mentored by your coach or boss for a long time. So there is something around not putting yourself in that space, but also that kind of confidence gap of what you were saying is not, we're not braggers in that sense,
Exactly. I
are
mean, women don't want to, put themselves forward for roles until they feel that they've completely nailed it, that they're completely ready before applying for a role. Whereas others think, well, I'll figure it out until, when I get there, fake it till you make it. But you've almost got to have confidence, I think, for some women to be confident that if you fake it, you will make it. Fake it till you make it assumes that you will get there inevitably. And I think confidence is such a challenging barrier for women that even faking it till you make it is asking a lot. So, to be fair, most leadership jobs are learned while you're doing them. Nobody arrives in that role knowing everything. And I've always said, if you think you can do the job standing on your head, you should not take the job because it will not be fulfilling for you. So it's wrapping all of those things together. The logic of, I'm not going to find myself stretched if I can do the job standing on my head, versus the emotional, which is, oh, I really want to know that I can do everything before I put myself forward for it. Nobody arrives knowing everything.
That's the thing. I think if we do wait until we feel completely comfortable, we'll always wait. We'll always never take that step. And that's the point, isn't it? That, growth should, and usually, most of the time, if you're doing it right, feels uncomfortable because that's the stretch that you're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we carry, as we've said, a lot of invisible expectations. Can I be ambitious? Can I still be present for my family? Will people think I've changed? Am I being too pushy? Men ask themselves those questions too, of course. But I think women often carry an extra layer of emotional responsibility around success.
Possibly. And also something when you were talking is so that almost was forming in my mind is something else I think I've mentioned it before. When you start in a job, you have that honeymoon period and then you see the reality. But I think it's something around expectation versus reality. So, in interviews, for example, around progress,
Yeah.
I don't think there's one woman that I haven't spoken to that's had a question or they've asked a question around progression in the organization. And often in interviews, they're always told the same thing: loads of progression opportunities. It's a great stepping stone. You'll get leadership exposure in this role, and you do it all, and you go to you go to your meetings, and absolutely nothing happens.
Yeah. You're still doing the job.
Tumbleweed.
Yeah, you're still doing the same job 3 years later,
But that's exactly my point, is that, no one necessarily lied outright. Potentially they might have progressed, but that was probably through a different opportunity. But then they just painted this very unrealistic, or they painted a picture that actually never materialised. And I think that then sits with somebody's frustration of going, I don't even know if I want to stay here. And that's potentially why you talk about moving to the elevator and you're banging against your head against a brick wall, because none of these actual promises or opportunities ever arise then. And that just is more exasperating, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the hardest things because you do start questioning yourself. I know you don't go to an interview and the organisation says, come and work for us. We're deadbeat. You're not going to get anywhere, but we'd like to offer you the job anyway. So I always talk about a recruitment interview being a buying and selling exchange. You're buying an organisation, you're selling yourself. The organisation's selling its opportunities and buying the successful candidate. But assuming that there are enough markers that convinced past tense that there were opportunities, 3 years forward, you then start to think, well, maybe it is me. Maybe I'm not progressing because I'm not good enough. And, tying into this sort of woman's self-doubt and self-questioning, actually, there probably was nowhere to progress to.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing, isn't it? There's no hope isn't actually a career strategy. I'm just hoping things will change.
Yeah.
I definitely feel more comfortable about being more direct. I think and supporting women to be more direct in interviews, or even in that initial pre-interview stage when you can call somebody and ask them about the job, about, being quite direct about, what does progression actually look like? Why is the position open, and what did the last person go on to do? Because that does give you a bit of although they may brush it under the carpet and say something else, you are probing to understand what their culture's like a little bit, and understand how often it happens, I think that's a great indicate and flag for you to want to go for that job interview in the first place. Because why would you put all that effort into an application and go interview to go through the same thing again? So I think being wiser and more strategic pre-interview is a really good strategy, I think, to be able to do that.
Yeah. No, I agree. And, as we said, organisations don't do it deliberately. Sometimes they genuinely hope that the opportunities appear. People do need clarity. But the other thing is, when you're being interviewed in a point in time, and both parties are discussing aspirations for the future, where the organisation's going to go, the growth, the market sector that it's in, the local, national, global economy. All of those things are open to change. Yes, they are open to change, and yes, we need clarity. Those two things are really difficult to definitely get right every time.
I'm wondering if there's something different around a bottleneck that happens in that senior leadership role, especially so, for depending who our listeners and what career sectors there is, if you look in healthcare or mental health or therapy, it's often very heavy women in management.
Yeah.
But exec roles, senior roles in that point, goes back to my previous point about people staying there a lot longer. There's no actual progression when you get to a certain stage. And then it becomes a really crowded staircase. So when we're talking about heels in the hierarchy, we're talking about, we're waiting for the next potential step up. But that may not look directly up, isn't it? Because if you're in an organisation where it's just very full, then it's very difficult, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, in traditional male-dominated sectors, the barriers are more obvious. But sometimes the career path is clearer. You know what the next step is. Men are actually quite ambitious, so they're often moving on, up or out. You know where the next step is. You've just got to get there.
That is an interesting point, I think. But I think different doesn't always make it easier, though. It just means that the obstacles, like you say, do look different. And if we pretend that every workplace has the same challenges, I do think that we miss a lot of important nuances, if I can say that word properly. But I think it's about, what do we do about that then? What does that, I suppose it makes me think, where does that leave us if we're in that position, if our listeners are in that point where they're not quite sure where to go next, or they feel like they're kind of trapped in a situation of they're not sure the next step. I think maybe the first thing is being really honest with ourselves of, A, do I really want progression, or do I need to leave the organisation? Because I think if it's progression, then it's about role and it's about skill set. If it's about the organisation, then that's about the culture, and that's not about the job, is it? So I think they're two different things to really be honest about. Because actually not everybody in reality wants a progression, or they want more flexibility. They want more, success looks different to different people. Progression looks different and not everybody wants what everyone thinks they should want. And I think that's absolutely fine. So leadership isn't, the only measure of success at all.
No, I agree. And I was recalling one organisation that I worked for, and I, was lucky enough to be given some quite senior opportunities. And then I found myself constantly doing board reports. And I actually used to sort of half jokingly at home refer to them as bored reports, BORED, because I just found it so boring and tedious to constantly doing reports rather than doing the doing, which is an expression, even as I use it, that is I've been around a lot where people say, well, you're a leader now, stop doing the doing. But that's where your skill set was. That's where your passion is. So, I agree. Leadership isn't the only measure of success. If you do want it, I would argue, own it. Don't apologize for wanting more responsibility or influence, whether that's vertical or horizontal, or as you say, different opportunities of flexibility or exposure through projects to different areas of your profession or sector. So don't apologize for wanting more responsibility or more influence. Ambition shouldn't feel like a dirty word.
And I suppose that follows on in terms of, don't assume something's impossible just because you've tried something once and didn't work.
Mm.
Because I think we learn from our mistakes, we learn from faults, we learn from failures. And I think there is that element of, why should we apologize for wanting to be successful or influential? That does look different. It doesn't have to be about what people think it means. We don't have to apologize for that. But I do think you need to ask the question, is this what I want?
Yeah.
Applied for the role, even if you feel like it's a stretch, have those conversations. The answer may still not be, maybe not no, but at least they know that's where you're going to. That's where your head is at, the right thing. That you've put the seed in their mind in your management conversations of, I want to do more. I want to have more, opportunities. When they talk about career development, they should also be thinking about what studies you want to be thinking about within the organisation, and you can have those conversations. So, but even if it's a no, it could be a not yet. Or it
Yes.
could be, thinking about the next step. So at least you're investing in yourself. And I think that's really important, isn't it? So
Yeah, I'd say not necessarily look for mentors in a formal sense. They are absolutely brilliant. And if somebody gets an opportunity to have a mentor, then, go for it. I was talking to somebody the other day about, do you need a mentor or do you need what I called a bitch buddy, which was somebody who was in the same sector with the same challenges that you could just let off steam with, but would also support you with, interesting perspectives. So, small M mentor, capital M mentor, if you get the opportunity. And if they have the right recommendations and mindset and experience to properly mentor, I'd also say look for advocates, because again, if you've got people in your corner, that can be really great because they can create opportunities for you. Sometimes the difference between wanting to be noticed and actually moving forward are people who advocate for you, seeing the opportunities, being exposed to a context where they can put you forward that you may not be in that meeting for. That can be really, really powerful and help you to move forward.
I think they're great points, I think, to finish with, because I think sometimes, we can have listeners going, that's all great advice we're thinking about, but what does that look like? And I think
Yeah.
having allied people you can speak to, and that's not your own head, is so important. And people that understand that kind of stepping stones and how to have those conversations. So if thinking of glass ceilings, are they real? I think absolutely. I think we will kind of confirm they are. But I also wonder, it's not really from this conversation that it's the way that we think or we imagine them to be. And sometimes absolutely they can be organizational. And sometimes we have to admit it, there could be cultural
Yeah.
in the way that it is. And also from our conversations, sometimes they're actually built from our own assumptions that we've carried around for years and our own barriers. So I do think they absolutely exist, but maybe it just made me realise they may look different.
And I think you're right. I mean, perhaps the challenge is working out which one you're facing, because if it is structural, we need organisations to change. And they do change on a fairly regular basis, some of them, but not all of them. If it's an internal structural issue, then maybe that's something that we can start changing ourselves by, you know, taking the elevator up to another floor and trying to do that. But, you know, it's if change isn't happening, you've then got to do something to change your own circumstances, whatever that is, because that's how you can get the momentum, I guess.
Yeah. But I think either way, I think that conversation really matters. Not because there's actually one answer, because I think it's understanding what those barriers are in the first way, moving towards it. So yeah, I think it's been a great conversation today. I think it's important to vocalize some of those things, and sometimes realigning that we can also be our own barriers. It's not everybody else has been helpful for me.
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, we would love to hear what you think. Have you experienced a glass ceiling? Have you smashed a glass ceiling? Have you looked back and realized that you've underestimated yourself? They're all really valid questions that we can talk about, but we're really interested in your perspective on those.
And if you can find us on social media, please download our episodes and make sure that you interact with us, say hi, and wherever you listen to your podcast, if you're joining us freshly today, you're welcome. And please continue to listen for another episode of Heels in the Hierarchy.
And we would say, keep your heels high.
And your standards higher.
Until next time, take care. Bye.